Section 19 of Gray's Anatomy Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Anatomy of the Human Body Part 3 by Henry Gray. The axilla, the axillary artery. 4b. The axilla. The axilla is a pyramidal space situated between the upper lateral part of the chest and the medial side of the arm. Boundaries. The apex, which is directed upward toward the root of the neck, corresponds to the interval between the outer border of the first rib, the superior border of the scapula, and the posterior surface of the clavicle, and through it the axillary vessels and nerves pass. The base, directed downward, is broad at the chest but narrow and pointed at the arm. It is formed by the integument and the thick layer of the fascia, the axillary fascia, extending between the lower border of the pectoralis major in front and the lower border of the latissimus dorsi behind. The anterior wall is formed by the pectoralis major and minor, the former covering the whole of this wall and the latter only its central part. The space between the upper border of the pectoralis minor and the clavicle is occupied by the coracoclavicular fascia. The posterior wall, which extends somewhat lower than the anterior, is formed by the subscapularis above, the teres major and the latissimus dorsi below. On the medial side are the first four ribs, with their corresponding intercostals, and part of the serratus anterior. On the lateral side, where the anterior and posterior walls converge, the space is narrow, and bounded by the humerus, the coracobrachialis, and the biceps brachii. Contents. It contains the axillary vessels and the brachial plexus of nerves, with their branches, some branches of the intercostal nerves, together with a quantity of fat and loose areolar tissue. The axillary artery and vein, with the brachial plexus of nerves, extend obliquely along the lateral boundary of the axilla, from its apex to its base, and are placed much nearer to the anterior than the posterior wall. The vein lying to the thoracic side of the artery and partially concealing it. At the forepart of the axilla, in contact with the pectoralis, are the thoracic branches of the axillary artery, and along the lower margin of the pectoralis minor, the lateral thoracic artery extends to the side of the chest. At the back part, in contact with the lower margin of the subscapularis, are the subscapular vessels and nerves. Winding around the lateral border of this muscle are the scapular circumflex vessels, and close to the neck of the humerus, the posterior humeral circumflex vessels, and the axillary nerve curve backward to the shoulder. Along the medial or thoracic side no vessel of importance exists, the upper part of the space being crossed merely by a few small branches from the highest thoracic artery. There are some important nerves, however, in this situation, viz. the long thoracic nerve, descending on the surface of the serratus anterior, to which it is distributed, and the intercostobrachial nerve, perforating the upper and anterior part of this wall, and passing across the axilla to the medial side of the arm. The position and arrangement of the lymph glands are described on pages 699 and 700. 1. The axillary artery, the continuation of the subclavian, commences at the outer border of the first rib and ends at the lower border of the tendon of the teres major, where it takes the name of brachial. Its direction varies with the position of the limb. Thus, the vessel is nearly straight when the arm is directed at right angles with the trunk, concave upward when the arm is elevated above this, and convex upward and lateralward when the arm lies by the side. At its origin, the artery is very deeply situated, but near its termination is superficial, being covered only by the skin and fascia. To facilitate the description of the vessel, it is divided into three portions. The first part lies above, the second behind, and the third below the pectoralis minor. Relations. The first portion of the axillary artery is covered anteriorly by the clavicular portion of the pectoralis major and the coracoclavicular fascia, and is crossed by the lateral anterior thoracic nerve and the thoracicoacromial and cephalic veins. Posterior to it are the first intercostal space, the corresponding intercostalis externus, the first and second digitations of the serratus anterior, and the long thoracic and medial anterior thoracic nerves, and the medial cord of the brachial plexus. On its lateral side is the brachial plexus, from which it is separated by a little areolar tissue. On its medial or thoracic side is the axillary vein, which overlaps the artery. It is enclosed together with the axillary vein and the brachial plexus in a fibrous sheath, the axillary sheath. continuous above with the deep cervical fascia. The second portion of the axillary artery is covered anteriorly by the pectoralis major and minor. Posterior to it are the posterior cord of the brachial plexus and some areolar tissue, which intervenes between it and the subscapularis. On the medial side is the axillary vein, separated from the artery by the medial cord of the brachial plexus and the medial anterior thoracic nerve. On the lateral side is the lateral cord of the brachial plexus. Brachial plexus thus surrounds the artery on three sides and separates it from direct contact with the vein and adjacent muscles. The third portion of the axillary artery extends from the lower border of the pectoralis minor to the lower border of the tendon of the teres major. In front it is covered by the lower part of the pectoralis major above, but only by the integument and fascia below. Behind it is in relation with the lower part of the subscapularis and the tendons of the latissimus dorsi and the teres major. On its lateral side is the coracobrachialis, and on its medial or thoracic side the axillary vein. The nerves of the brachial plexus bear the following relations to this part of the artery. On the lateral side are the lateral head and the trunk of the median, on the musculocutaneous for a short distance, on the medial side the ulna between the vein and the artery, and the medial brachial cutaneous on the medial side of the vein. In front are the medial head of the median and the medial antebrachial cutaneous, and behind the radial and axillary, the latter only as far as the lower border of the subscapularis. Collateral circulation of the ligature of the axillary artery. If the artery be tied above the origin of the thoracoacromial, the collateral circulation will be carried on by the same branches as after the ligature on the third part of the subclavian. If at the lower point between the thoracoacromial and the subscapular, the lateral vessel, by its free anastomosis with the transverse scapula and the transverse cervical branches of the subclavian, will become the chief agent in carrying on the circulation. The lateral thoracic, if it be below the ligature, will materially contribute by its anastomosis with the intercostal and internal mammary arteries. If the point included in the ligature is below the origin of the subscapular artery, it will most probably also be below the origins of the two humeral circumflex arteries. The chief agents in restoring the circulations will then be the subscapular and the two humeral circumflex arteries, anastomosing with the arteria profunda brachii. Branches of the maxillary are: from first part, highest thoracic; from second part, thoracoacromial, lateral thoracic; from third part, subscapular, posterior humeral circumflex, anterior humeral circumflex. 1. The highest thoracic artery, arteria thoracalis suprema, superior thoracic artery, is a small vessel which may arise from the thoracoacromial, running forward and medialward along the upper border of the pectoralis minor. It passes between it and the pectoralis major to the side of the chest. It supplies branches to these muscles and to the parties of the thorax and anastomosis with the internal mammary and intercostal arteries. 2. The thoracoacromial artery, arteria thoracoacromialis, acromiothoracic artery, thoracic axis, is a short trunk which arises from the forepart of the axillary artery, its origin being generally overlapped by the upper edge of the pectoralis minor. Projecting forward to the upper border of this muscle, it pierces the coracoclavicular fascia and divides it into four branches: pectoral, acromial, clavicular, and deltoid. The pectoral branch descends between the two pectorales and is distributed to them and to the mamma, anastomosing with the intercostal branches of the internal mammary and with the lateral thoracic. The acromial branch runs lateralward over the coracoid process and under the deltoideus, to which it gives branches. It then pierces the muscle and ends in the acromion in an arterial network formed by branches from the transverse scapular, thoracoacromial, and posterior humeral circumflex arteries. The clavicular branch runs upward and medialward to the sternoclavicular joint, supplying this articulation in the subclavius. The deltoid humeral branch, often arising with the acromial, crosses over the pectoralis minor and passes in the same groove as the cephalic vein, between the pectoralis major and deltoideus, and gives branches to both muscles. 3. The lateral thoracic artery, arteria thoracalis lateralis, long thoracic artery, external mammary artery, follows the lower border of the pectoralis minor to the side of the chest, supplying the serratus anterior